So earlier today, I put out a TikTok and a reel asking you guys if you'd rather have the ASUS Flow X16 or the MacBook Pro 16, and the results were in favor of the X16. Now, don't get me wrong, I love this MacBook Pro 16. I use this every single time I travel to get my work done. The battery life is unmatched by any other similar laptop in its form factor, and the speakers are at the top of the list. But something about the RTX 3070 Ti and being able to game on a pinch is always there in the back of my mind. Now, in terms of build quality, I prefer the MacBook Pro 16. I think it's a better built product. It feels a lot more solid. The aluminum is not as thin as the Flow X16. It doesn't feel cheap. Like, this doesn't feel cheap either, but it doesn't feel as solid as the chassis on the MacBook Pro 16. Even little things like rounding out the edges, the way it feels in your hand, it's not sharp at all. Not that this is sharp, but the edges are obviously a little bit more cut than the MacBook Pro 16. Even little things, right? Like when you open up the MacBook Pro 16 with one hand, the display doesn't really wobble. When you open up the Flow X16 with one hand, there's a bit more wobble. And unfortunately, due to the heaviness of this mini LED display, when you pick it up, this thing kind of just flops down, right? The hinge is not strong enough to support this display. Now, granted, the non-mini LED version is a little bit lighter, so it can probably handle the screen a bit better, but the mini LED version, I don't know, it just feels like maybe after a year or two, this is gonna get a bit too loose and it's gonna annoy a lot of people. Even the tiny things, watch this. When I get down here with the Flow X16 and I let go, it just falls, right? With the MacBook Pro 16, it is stiff all the way down. Like, look at this. I'm gonna leave it right here. It's not gonna fall. I literally have to push it down. And then when it closes, it's such a quiet sound compared to this guy. In terms of size, they're very similar. The MacBook Pro 16 is thinner than the Flow X16, but in terms of dimensions, they're pretty much equal. The weight is pretty close. Like, you're not gonna feel like one is way heavier than the others since they're in the mid 4s. Ports are interesting though. It really comes down to personal preference. With the MacBook Pro 16, you can charge this using USB Type-C or the MagSafe connector, which means if you accidentally kick the cable, you're not gonna take the laptop off the table with it. It just gives you a separate way to charge it, and you can charge it using the 100 watt plus adapter that comes in the box. You got two Type-C ports or Thunderbolt 3 ports on the left-hand side, your audio jack, and then on the right-hand side, you have your HDMI, another Thunderbolt port, and then your SD card slot. The advantage to the Flow X16 is you get a bit more variety, right? Like, you only get one Type-C port that's exposed, but if you open up this mobile XG Connect port, there's another Type-C port inside. So technically you actually get two. Unfortunately, these are not Thunderbolt because it is using an AMD CPU. You have your audio jack, a proprietary charger, which is much bigger and heavier than the charger that the MacBook Pro uses. And instead of a micro or SD card slot rather, you get a micro SD card and you get USB-A ports, which is something you don't get on the MacBook Pro 16. Now, the screens are very interesting because they're both mini LED. They're both insanely bright and beautiful to look at. They get really bright. I think peak brightness on the MacBook Pro 16 reaches like 1600 if you leave it on a certain profile. With the ROG Flow, it has a peak brightness of 1100 nits, which is still insanely high, but for day-to-day use, SDR, you're looking at the display, usually they hover around 500, unless you're looking at specific HDR content, then that peak brightness goes up. I didn't notice any crazy PWM flicker on either of the devices. The advantage to the Flow X16 though, is you actually get a 165 Hertz display, a little better for gaming compared to 120 Hertz. For working, not a big deal, but if you're a gamer, having that extra 45 Hertz refresh rate will definitely make a difference. Webcams, no comparison. MacBook Pro 16 actually has a 1080p webcam. It looks way better than the 720p camera that the ROG Flow is using, but you do have a notch, which I know some of you feel very angry about. In terms of typing, I love both of these keyboards. I would say I like the travel distance better on the X16, but the overall feel and comfortability of the keyboard on the MacBook Pro is slightly better. Touchpads, They're both very accurate, but MacBook Pro 16 is still the gold standard, and I do find using this big, massive touchpad to be a lot more accurate than the one that the Flow X16 has. Now, you do have Touch ID to log you in with the MacBook Pro. There's no fingerprint scanner on the Flow X16, but it does support Windows Hello facial recognition if you want to use biometrics. Now, performance is where things get super interesting. Depending on what you're doing, you're going to prefer one computer over the other. In terms of specs, they're very different. One is using an M1 Pro, the other is using an AMD R9 6900HS, but everything else is fairly equal. Both with 32 gigabytes of RAM, both with 1 terabyte of NVMe SSD storage. Now, I'm a video creator. I edit a lot of videos in DaVinci Resolve. I ran it on both computers. I edited a video on both of these machines, and I did find that the timeline scrubbing is smoother on the MacBook Pro 16. But if you're talking about rendering files, and depending on what you render to, one can be faster than the other. In terms of H.264, the Flow X16 rendered the final video faster than the MacBook Pro 16. But if you render it in H.265, then the MacBook Pro 16 is faster. Now, when I say the timeline scrubbing is faster on the MacBook Pro, it's not like it's bad on the Flow X16, but it is noticeable. I did notice some frame drops. It's there. It's a combination of ProRes, Sony 422 10-bit footage on the timeline with a bunch of color corrections and transitions, and of course, effects. And the whole time while I was editing my video, fans blazing, okay? You can hear the fans. There's a tiny bit of cola wine with this guy. It's in your face. It can get annoying after a while. MacBook Pro 16 didn't even turn on the fans. Not even once. It's just quiet the entire time. And not even talking about off the outlet. Like, you unplug this thing, you lose a lot of your performance. It's gone. It's down the drain. With this guy, you disconnect it from the wall, you get the exact same performance. Now, if you're editing in Photoshop, it truly doesn't matter which laptop you go. These are both great for it. Comes down to RAM and drive speeds. But if you're doing things in After Effects, the MacBook Pro 16 actually performed better. And that kind of shocked me because in the early days, the MacBook Pros, the M series in general, didn't do well with After Effects. But after months and months of optimizations, things have changed and the MacBook Pro is at the top again. The AMD processor is just not as fast as what Intel has to offer. The benefit of going with AMD this year is obviously battery life, but I didn't find the battery life to be that great on this guy. I got under 6 hours of use before needing to charge, and that's just general productivity. Whereas this guy, I can comfortably edit a video and not have to worry about my battery dying. Now, there's two specific areas where the Flow X16 just does a much better job, and that's 3D work. So if you're using Blender or any sort of 3D based program, you need that RTX 3070 Ti. It's not even a competition. It just completely wipes the floor with the MacBook Pro 16. And the other area is if you like to game. In terms of fan noise, I already talked about it. This gets loud, this does not. In terms of heat, this gets hot, this does not. This ASUS ROG Flow X16 does get a little bit too hot for my liking. You can obviously do things like put it in tent mode, go out and purchase the XG Mobile to shift that GPU heat away to the external graphics card, but overall, this guy will get hot. So if you live in a hotter climate, that's something to keep in mind. But the Flow X16 does have one secret up its sleeve, and that's XG Mobile Connect. When you get back into the studio and you want a more powerful GPU than the RTX 3070 Ti, you can pick up the RTX 3080, push more power to it, and get much better frames, or even AMD's 6850 XT card. You have options for both. Whereas this guy, you can't do that. There's no external GPU support option. What you get is what you get to keep until you replace the computer. And on top of that, there's just no expandability with the MacBook Pro. Moving up to 1 terabyte or 2 terabytes is ridiculously expensive. It's actually criminal. Whereas this guy, if you're not happy with the storage size, you can open up the laptop, replace it whenever you want, and add more storage when you please. Even the RAM, there's 32 gigabytes inside of here right now, but there's 2 slots which are upgradable to 64. Honestly, both of these products have their advantages. If you're doing nothing but work and that's it, and you're compiling code or editing video or even doing After Effects, personally, I would lean towards the MacBook Pro. You're gonna get a quieter computer, better battery life, better speakers, better keyboard, the list goes on. But if you like to game or you're doing any sort of 3D work, then you gotta go for the Flow X16. It really comes down to your personal workflow, but please let me know in the comment section down below which one you would choose and why. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next one.